I was raised in a quaint little town in western Pennsylvania. In that community, hunting was more than a pastime. It was a tradition, a way of life, you might say. It was certainly my father's passion, his very essence, but it never resonated with me. Instead, I found solace in the world of books, immersing myself in literature and prose, a concept foreign to my father. My dislike of hunting didn't sit well with him, but it didn't dissuade him either. He would relentlessly drag me along on his numerous hunting excursions, adventures I would have gladly skipped if given the choice. The most chilling experience of my life, the absolute worst thing I ever saw, occurred in a place I'd never have ventured into by my own accord. At times, I count myself fortunate to have survived what occurred on that fateful autumn night. Yet there are moments like tonight when I question if surviving was a stroke of luck at all. In 1974, me, my dad, his coworker Gary, and Gary's son Joey traveled to a quaint lodge in a nearby hunting reserve. Gary had inherited the place from his father after he passed. I had had the displeasure of meeting Gary before and thought he was a real jerk. Dad showed a remarkable level of patience around him, probably only because he wanted to use his lodge. As for Joey, he mirrored his father's attitude, and I knew this because we actually went to the same high school. Being older yet behind me in school, he was known for his aggressive behavior on and off the football field, occasionally targeting me as well. As far as intelligence goes, he was about as sharp as a bowling ball. The disdain Gary and Joey felt toward me was evident. They seized every chance to mock my small stature, my oversized glasses, my musical tastes, and my tie-dye shirts. Never around Dad, naturally, since he wouldn't stand for anyone bullying me. We arrived late that Friday night, and the following day our plan was to get out in the woods before daybreak. But Dad and Gary spent that Friday evening with their friends Jim Beam and Jack Daniels. You know, those bottled companions that are fun as hell the night you hang out with them, but quickly wear out their welcome the following morning. Dad told me on more than one occasion that there are 2 times deer are most active, in the early morning and late afternoon. Those are the times you want to be there. When they're on the move, you're more likely to bag one. Whether due to bad luck or perhaps a hangover, they didn't manage to shoot anything that morning, so we all headed back out again late that afternoon. Dad and Gary each bagged a buck just before dusk, so Joey and I were tasked with field dressing them and driving them back to the lodge, while Dad and Gary started grilling up steaks for dinner. Field dressing is the process of removing all the deer's internal organs. It's something you want to do as soon as possible. The longer you delay it, the more risk you run of spoiling the meat. And while Joey wasn't much of a shot, even I had to admit he was pretty skilled at it. Joey grabbed his knife and began the task at hand. He initiated the cut at the hind end of the deer and proceeded upwards to the rib cage, meticulously using both his fingers and the blade to detach part of the hide from the carcass. His careful technique was to prevent any damage to the stomach or intestines, as such a mistake would taint the meat. Once he severed the breastbone and created cuts near the pelvic area, he methodically removed the internal organs, cutting away the connective tissues that secured them. As he worked on the second buck, I noticed the fading twilight casting rays across his back and my face. Suddenly, a swift shadow passed through the trees to my left, momentarily obscuring the light, something I caught in my peripheral vision. The shadow moved so quickly that by the time I had turned my head toward it, it was already gone. "What was that?" I blurted out, alarmed and trying to process what I had just seen. "What?" Joey asked in an annoyed tone without looking up, engrossed in his effort to pry open the second buck's breastbone. "There was this massive shadow, like everything just darkened for a split second," I replied. "I didn't see nothing. Now shut up. I want to wrap this up. Daylight's fading," Joey grunted. When he finished, he stood up and sighed, staring down at his watch, seemingly pleased with his quick work. "That must be a record for me," he gloated. He eyed me up and down with a mixture of disgust and impatience. "Well, what the hell are you waiting for, asswipe? Go on, grab the deer carts," he yelled. I sighed as I turned around and sullenly trotted in the direction of my dad's pickup about a quarter mile from where we were. When I reached the truck, I awkwardly pulled the 2 deer carts from the back. As I slammed the tailgate shut, a bleating sound behind me caught my attention. I turned to see a doe standing there, her beautiful black eyes locked on mine. I stared in amazement, slowly moving closer to her, expecting her to dart away at any moment. But she didn't. Instead, she inched closer to me, toward my outstretched hand. I couldn't help but smile when her wet black nose touched my fingertips. Remembering the apple in my backpack, I went to the truck, took out a pocket knife, and sliced it up. The dough waited patiently for me to return. I extended my hand again, offering a few small slices, which she graciously ate. I squatted down and petted her head. I said, "I'm sorry about your friends." She finished up the last of the slices in my hand. "You shouldn't be here. It isn't safe," I warned, looking into her eyes. Just then I caught a glimpse of the shadow again out of the corner of my eye. I whipped my head to the right, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. The doe continued nibbling on an apple slice I had dropped, until a loud gunshot rang out, causing her to run off. I heard Joey's obnoxious laugh from about 30 yards away. "Damn, I almost had the little bitch," he said with a smug grin. "I guess she'll keep her hide after all," he added, glaring at me as if trying to provoke a fight. My eyes narrowed as I glared back at him. Then I watched the doe disappear into the thick trees. I felt more grateful than ever that Joey couldn't hit the broadside of a barn. At nightfall, Dad and Gary started the caping, that is, skinning the deer carcasses. By then, Dad and Gary were all 3 sheets to the wind, and Joey wasn't far behind, having sneaked more than a few swigs from his dad's whiskey bottle. Joe and I sat around a bonfire while Dad and Gary got to work on the skinning. Gary cut the buck's hide around its hind legs and peeled it downwards, using his knife to help separate the pelt from the meat. After he was done, he challenged my dad to beat his time. Right around the time Dad drunkenly got up from his rocking chair to accept Gary's challenge, I got up to take a leak. Now it's a bit embarrassing to admit, but I've always had what they call shy bladder syndrome. In other words, it's always been hard for me to piss in front of most people for whatever reason, so I trekked a ways into the woods to relieve myself. Moonlight bathed the trees and open meadow that night. I breathed in the crisp night air. I focused on aiming for a hole in a fallen tree when a shadow fell over me for the 3rd time. This time, it lingered. I glanced up and immediately locked my gaze on something hovering in the sky, at least 100 yards away. It was an enormous black inverted triangle. I was absolutely stunned, gasping as I stared at it. Fear and confusion gripped me in equal measure. Instinctively, I began stepping backward. I then tripped over a log and landed on my back. The triangle moved toward me, and as it approached, I got a better sense of its size. It was about 300 feet tall, but only 50 feet wide at its base. There were no doors or windows, just a black, shiny, marble-like surface that gleamed in the bright moonlight. It emitted a thin, luminescent ray that shone directly on my face. I stood up to run, but in my haste, I tripped again, falling flat on my face. As I turned to face it, the light ray scanned up and down my body. I held out a hand, scooting backward. I had no idea what it was going to do, but I definitely didn't want to find out. I pulled myself off the ground and started running to the cabin, glancing back to see the light tracking me. I stumbled again, smacking my face on a stone. Blood gushed from my nostrils. The ship lowered silently, and the band of light shifted from me to the edge of the woods, toward the lodge where Dad was finishing up skinning the 2nd deer. After a few moments, the light vanished. I yelled for help. Joey was the first to hear me and shouted for Dad and Gary to come quickly. Despite the blood pouring down my face, my nose wasn't broken. They helped me up and carried me back to the cabin. Once inside, they asked what had happened. I told them what I had seen. Gary was the first to chuckle, and Dad and Joey soon followed. Joey joked that I couldn't hold my liquor, and Dad teasingly asked if Gary's stash of weed was lighter than when we left. But just as Dad delivered his punchline, we all heard a wild scream outside, and everyone jolted at the horrible noise. "What the hell was that?" Joey shouted. "Mountain lion?" Gary asked, looking to Dad for confirmation. "In PA? Nah, that ain't it." "Well then what?" "Shh, shut up for a minute." We heard that awful screeching again, but this time there were multiple screams, louder and closer than before. Dad and Gary grabbed their rifles and told Joey and me to head upstairs. Dad told Gary to turn the lights off in the hope that whatever was out there couldn't see us inside the house. As he opened the shutters, we all saw them. Pairs of red glowing eyes in the trees. First about 10 pairs, then 15, 20, 30. And these beaming eyes grew larger as whatever bodies they were attached to were moving quickly toward the lodge. Dad shouted something I couldn't quite make out, then opened fire. Gary rushed to his side, yelling for Joey to follow. Joey, trying to mask his panic, grabbed his rifle and dutifully rushed back downstairs to join them, while I regretfully froze in sheer terror. Dad yelled for Gary and Joey to close the shutters and head out back to start the trucks. Only moments after running out the back, Gary and Joey burst back through the door, locking it behind them, out of breath. "We're surrounded!" Gary shouted at Dad, looking to him for guidance. They're all over the place, even around the truck!" Joey cried, his voice filled with panic. We heard the shrieks again, but this time they were right outside. The walls and roof shook with the force of the banging and thumping. Suddenly the shutters shattered, splintering into pieces and scattering small planks of wood across the room. For the first time I saw them clearly, creatures with a humanoid form, glowing red eyes, and a black, sinewy exterior. Dad and Gary kept firing their guns, but it didn't seem to make a difference. For every creature they blasted, it felt like two emerged to take its place. Joey let out a high-pitched shriek when he saw them. He shakily aimed his rifle while backing up to the door. I noticed the door behind him rattling the deadbolt, barely holding on, the sound of wood splintering. "Joey, look out!" I screamed, but it was too late. One of them sank its claws into Joey's armpits and whisked him away in an instant. Gary screamed and fired at the creature that had seized Joey, unaware that 5 more had crept up on him. They hooked their claws under his armpits and hauled him off too. Dad rushed up the stairs and we raced to the balcony, which looked clear for a moment. We reached the end of the deck, and Dad looked at me and said, "Jump." I glanced down at the river below. The creatures were scaling the walls of the lodge, closing in on us. Dad loaded his rifle and amidst the chaos gave me a strange look, as if he were seeing me for the last time. Fear and sadness lingered on his rugged face. He opened his mouth, but another screech startled us both. "Don't look back," he yelled, and shoved me over the railing. I fell backwards, splashing into the icy river below. Just before I resurfaced, I heard muffled gunfire and my father's screams. The currents felt stronger than they appeared from the balcony, whisking me downstream until I struggled to keep my head above water. Before long, I found myself in the river's turbulent rapids. Just when I thought things couldn't get worse, the roaring of the rapids intensified. I glanced ahead and panicked at the sight of a steep drop-off, a waterfall straight ahead. My heart pounded wildly as the cold water numbed my extremities. Despite my best efforts, I couldn't make any headway toward the riverbanks. I finally shut my eyes and said a quick, silent prayer as I approached the drop-off. I remember going headfirst over the fall, the free-fall feeling endless. I don't recall hitting the water, just a moment of blackness, then struggling to reach the surface. Once my head hit the air, I used every ounce of energy I had left to swim to the shore. I spotted a log from a dead tree jutting into the water and desperately reached for it, managing to catch the end with my hand before being pulled downstream any further. I clawed at the mud, trying to pull myself out of the water. Completely out of breath, I finally made it ashore and glanced back at the massive waterfall, at least 75 to 100 feet high. My gaze didn't linger long on it, as I heard an awful shrieking in the near distance. At first I wondered if it came from my father, Gary, Joey, or them. When I heard it a second time, I recognized Joey's voice. Despite my intense fear, the most intense I had ever experienced, I knew I couldn't flee in good conscience. I pulled myself to my feet, unsure of what to do. I had no rifle or plan of attack, but I had to try to save them if I could. Mostly Dad. but I also couldn't leave Gary and Joey to whatever horrible fate awaited them. I moved as quickly as I could toward Joey's cries and pleas in the dark. I stopped when I came upon a group of the creatures in the clearing, the same clearing where Joey and I had been earlier that day. I dropped to the ground to avoid being noticed. Peeking up, I saw Joey lying on his back, with his hands out in front of him, surrounded by them. A ray of translucent blue light emanated from one of their eyes, displaying a moving image like a hologram. It took me a moment to understand what I was seeing, but then I recognized the figures in the image. It was me and Joey from earlier that day. The perspective matched exactly where I had noticed the moving shadow. The other aliens watched the footage, and when it reached the part where Joey had ordered me to get the deer carts, they all turned to one of the creatures. This one stood taller than the others, exuding a commanding presence that marked him as their leader. The leader moved toward Joey. "No, no, no!" Joey shrieked. The other aliens seized him as he struggled against their firm grasp. "Let me go!" he hollered. When the leader removed Joey's knife from the sheath on his belt, my stomach dropped as I realized what was about to happen. The footage replayed from the start, as the leader imitated the field dressing technique on Joey himself. He made a cut near Joey's legs, eliciting blood-curdling screams, and then moved upwards to the base of the ribcage, using his claws and knife to peel his hide from his body. Joey's screams were still piercing the air when the leader cut into his pelvic bone, but soon after severing his breastbone, Joey bled out, and his screams grew weaker and fainter. By the time his internal organs were being removed, he was already dead. I had never felt so terrible. Despite my intense dislike for Joey, I was racked with guilt for not doing anything to save him. I noticed one of them briefly examining Joey's rifle before discarding it. Fortunately, it landed in my general direction, only several yards away. I crept closer to it as quietly as possible. But just as I reached for it, a twig snapped under my left foot. I felt the red glowing eyes fix on me, followed by those dreadful banshee screams I had heard earlier. I locked eyes with the leader as he tilted his head sideways as if to study me, while the others charged straight at me. I bolted through the woods as fast as I could. My heart pounded wildly and my breath quickened in the cold night air. I pushed my arms and legs to move faster and faster, but I could feel and hear them closing in. I glanced back to see them gaining. As I turned forward again, I slammed right into a tree, sending me sprawling on my back and tumbling down a steep hill. At the bottom, I spotted a crevice between two giant boulders to my left, partially hidden by dense brush and a fallen tree. I quickly ran to it and squeezed myself in as far as I could, hoping they wouldn't see me and would think I had fled in another direction. Whether it was luck or a prayer answered, they did. As their shrieks grew distant and faint, I cautiously emerged from the crevice, only to find one of them, likely left behind to catch me if I doubled back, staring right at me. He charged at me full speed. My rifle jammed, and just as the creature leapt, I swung the rifle like a baseball bat, striking him on the side of his head and sending him to the ground. Without a second thought, I pressed the muzzle to his face, but even with every justification, I couldn't pull the trigger. The creature screamed just before I struck his face hard with the butt of my rifle, leaving him unconscious. I sprinted in the direction of the lodge, hearing my dad's voice growing louder the closer I got. He was pleading for his life, and I could hear Gary's cries too. I kept following the noise in an effort to find them, and eventually I did. I saw my father and Gary hanging nude from the bottom of the deck, surrounded by them. A translucent image was projected on the lodge wall from the leader's eyes, and I gasped in horror when I saw what it was, realizing what it meant for Dad and Gary. The image showed Dad and Gary skinning the bucks. Without thinking, I steadied my rifle and aimed at the leader's head. Just as I was about to pull the trigger, I felt cold, leathery claws dig into my neck, yanking me backward. The creature wrenched the gun from my hand and tossed it aside as the leader watched. The creature before me grabbed my neck and lifted me into the air, carrying me closer to the sacrifice happening under the lodge deck. I tried to scream to call out to my dad, but no words came out. My father looked at the leader and pleaded, "Let him go. Please spare my boy." He then took one final look at me with that same resigned stare, his face pale with sweat, his expression eerily calm, accepting his fate. The leader slowly turned his head toward me, then back to my dad, and raised Gary's hunting knife to make the first cut behind my father's knee. Just before he did, Dad said, "I love you. Close your eyes, son." I cried and would have screamed if the creature's grip hadn't constricted my vocal cords. I shut my eyes and heard my dad's terrible screams. Blood splattering on the concrete porch, followed by Gary's fearful pleading and crying. The creature's grip on my neck loosened, and I fell to the ground. When my dad's screaming stopped, I made a mistake I still regret to this day. I opened my eyes. My dad's flayed corpse swung like a pendulum from the rafters, his mouth agape and lifeless eyes staring into nothingness. Below him, a pool of blood grew larger, eventually spilling over the edges of the concrete slab. The leader then turned to Gary, whose screams were even louder than my dad's. I quickly shut my eyes again as his high-pitched cries reached a crescendo before fading into silence. I heard the snapping of twigs and the crunching of leaves as the creatures encircled me, the very ones I had fled from before. I believed death was inevitable at that moment and had resigned myself to it. I even welcomed the thought. It was the manner in which I would meet it that frightened me. But at that moment, I decided to do something. I decided to look the leader in the eyes. It was the least I could do to be brave in my final moments, as a last act of defiance that would have made Dad proud. The circle opened, making way for the leader, who slowly approached me, holding the entrails of Dad, Gary, or perhaps both. He extended his hand, offering the entrails to me as he knelt down and caressed my head. He opened his mouth and, in my voice, repeated the words I had uttered earlier that day. "I'm sorry about your friends." I recoiled, turning my head away in fear and disgust. He continued, "You shouldn't be here. It isn't safe." I sobbed. I saw the spacecraft eclipse the moon above me just before it descended to the ground. The creatures raced into it, and the leader's red eyes lingered on me for a moment before he too departed in the craft, leaving the gutted and skinned carcasses behind. I'm an old man now, living in a place that's somewhere between an insane asylum and a nursing home. I don't cause any trouble, and I never asked for much. Just a room without a view. But those bastards just moved me into one. Tonight the moon is out, shining as brightly as it did the night I lost Dad. There's a new orderly working the night shift. The sadistic son of a bitch has it out for me. He came by an hour ago and told me that he had heard about me. He said that I got lucky getting away with murdering my dad and the others, but that he plans to make my life a living hell as punishment for what I did. And as he glared at me, he peeled an apple with his pocket knife. And I swear to God, for a split second, something outside my window blocked the moonlight. Could it be their ship? Could it be that harbinger of death floating in the sky? I think it is. Now I'm just waiting for those red eyes to appear outside my window. They'll be here soon, I know it. It's just a matter of time. But when they come, I have one thing going for me. Every day since that night, I've lived by the golden rule. You know the one. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. You won't catch me firing a gun at an animal, stepping on a bug, and you sure as hell won't see me skinning so much as a potato. Maybe when they come, they'll spare me a second time. Maybe, just maybe, I'll keep my hide after all.